Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Colleen Benelli, and here with Robyn Benelli, and we are so excited today to talk to Justin Stein, and he is going to share about his upcoming book, and so we'll talk all about that, the name, how to find it, and alternate currents, Reiki's circulation in the 20th century North Pacific. And this is really hot off the press. This is being it will be published September 30th, Justin.
That's right. I literally just got my own copy yesterday.
Oh, that is just the best. Is that a picture of Mrs. Takata?
Yes, actually, this is a really beautiful photo that the original print is about 1 inch tall. Like maybe it's like one of these tiny, like almost the size of the negative. And we found it in an envelope that was almost thrown out when we were going through Phyllis Furumoto's items that she received from her mother, from her grandmother, and getting them ready for the archive that's now at the University of California, Santa Barbara. There was this envelope that we thought was like empty, and then it was like, let's just look inside before we toss it out. And there were these two tiny photographs inside, and I just love these photographs so much. So maybe for people listening to the audio, I could describe. It's on the cover of the book. Hawayo Takata. It's around 1940, so she would have been about 39 years old, on the front porch of her new home in Hilo on the Big Island of Hawaii, which was also her clinic. And she seems, I think that her pride, like she seems so proud of having this new space, and she's leaning forward on the front porch veranda kind of, and there's a sign that hanging both in English and in Japanese saying this is her Reiki clinic. It says Reiki sanitarium treatments in English, and Reiki ryoho in Japanese. And so I think it really is this like kind of, I don't know, moment of Reiki's having left the Japanese archipelago and taking on new forms in Hawaii, being translated for audiences that don't speak Japanese, and also just kind of this role that she played as that kind of propagator. I don't want to say evangelist, but that is a word that kind of comes to mind. Reiki. Yeah, that she bringing it to new audiences in new lands, in new languages. Yeah, so I really love the photo, and I'm really glad. When I sent it to them at the press, I said, "Is this like okay? The DPI, the resolution of the scan, is it okay? Because I know the original is very, very small, and they were able to work their magic and make a beautiful cover out of it." So
It is such a beautiful photo because it really personalizes her.
Yeah.
The other photo that we have is so formal. And this, like you say, I mean, she's just glowing in this picture. And it's just beautiful. So I saw that. Of course, you sent me the link to the book, and with the uhpresshawaii.edu. But anyway, so I got to look at that cover, and it really felt like a shift in knowing her.
Well, and I think that's another part of this research, is what everybody knows about her is really the last years of her life, when she was a grandmother, when she was an elder. And what a lot of the book is actually looking at is, how did she get there? How did Reiki get there? Right. And looking at that transformation, her own maturation process, Reiki's own, development and evolution, before 1974 or whatever, when we really start seeing her big teaching, 73, 74, we really start seeing her big teaching activities on the mainland. There's a lot of kind of gap between, people talk about Usui Sensei and a little bit about Hayashi Sensei, and then when we talk about Takada Sensei, usually there's like a 50-year gap or something in there. So that's really what a lot of the book is trying to unpack, is how did it get from here to there, and what happened in between. And yeah.
I'm so fascinated. I love the history of Reiki anyway, but like you say, I have a pretty good history with Usui Sensei, some with Hayashi, and then you're right. What I know about Mrs. Takada is really from, a little bit with her relationship with Hayashi, and then in the late, the 1970s.
Yeah.
And the Reiki Alliance afterwards. So I'm just really excited. Well, let me tell everybody about you.
Okay.
And then we want to hear it all. Just super excited to hear it. So, all right. Well, this is Justin Stein, and he is a PhD, University of Toronto, study of religion. He's a scholar of Japanese spiritual and religious practices, and he's the chair of the Asian Studies program. I hope I say this right, Kwantlen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Kwantlen Polytechnic University in British Columbia. His forthcoming book, Alternate Currents, Reiki's Circulation in the 20th-Century North Pacific, it's what we were just talking about, University of Hawaii Press, and it is released on September 30th. So we'll talk about how they can get it in just a minute. And then the book actually examines how Reiki was produced out of transnational exchanges between Japan and the US between the 1920s and the 1970s. And he has also published his research in peer-reviewed journals, including Japanese Religions and Asian Medicine, and edited volumes, including the Routledge Handbook of Religion, Medicine, and Health, which he also co-edited. So, Justin, you have on Facebook, your Facebook is JBS, so Justin B. Stein Reiki Research. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's right. That's I publish kind of my new findings and things. There, I actually have something that I've been meaning to write, and then also in terms of I'll be talking about this podcast on there and various things that I'm doing. So that's the best place to keep up with me.
Okay, great. And then your website is justinstein.academia.edu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's where, if you want to read other things that I've written, a lot of my publications are available there as well.
Great. So that's justinstein.academia.edu. And of course, we will put all these in the show notes. And then the uhspress.hawaii.edu is where they find the book.
Yeah, you can buy it directly from the publisher there. You can also just go into your local bookstore. I don't know in every country around the world, but certainly in the US or Canada, or I think a lot of parts of Europe, they have distribution around the world, and support local businesses. My local bookstore offers everything exactly the same price as you could buy it on Amazon, except for you're supporting your local economy, your local business owners. So yeah, if you just give them the name of the book, Alternate Currents, my name, Justin Stein, you should be able to find it. Sometimes people want the ISBN number, but you can look that up pretty easily with Google, things like that too. But yeah, it's also available for pre-order on anywhere you would find books online. They have it for pre-order right now.
Great. And did I hear you say it'll also be on Amazon?
It is, yeah, and Barnes and Noble,
okay.
and where anywhere you buy books online.
Okay.
But yeah,
good to know.
I'm always supporting the little guy. We're trying to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Well, okay, so we did your bio and we get to the formal part, but now why don't you just tell us about you and your story, and go ahead and just share.
What led you to Reiki too?
What led you to Reiki?
Yeah. What led me to Reiki? Sure. Yeah. I'll try to keep it fairly brief, but if there's anything in particular you want to know more about, just let me know. But yeah, I grew up in New York, in the New York suburbs, although I live in Canada now. And my family, I was exposed to various kind of spiritual practices from an early age. My mom was a dedicated TM practitioner before I was born. We grew up going to kind of spiritual healer who does muscle testing, applied kinesiology, and magnetic fields and crystals, and I was exposed to all of that from a young age. She came to my bar mitzvah. She's a close family friend, and
Wow.
so I and then as a kid, I was really interested in what you might call paranormal, parapsychology. I read a lot of books about hypnosis and meditation, and so from an early age, I was into a lot of this kind of human potential kind of stuff. At the same time, like with a bit of a skeptical mind as well, right? It's just that there are certain things that we have been able to prove. There are certain things that maybe have been debunked. And then there's other things in the middle that could be possible that we don't really know one way or another. And so I think that's the kind of stuff that was interesting for me, was that kind of unknown, right? And when I was in university, I think I was about 19 or 20. I was home for the summer, and a friend asked if I knew about chakras, and I said, "No, what's that?" And so I started down. His brother was teaching this healing practice with hands-on on the chakras, using just the fingertips, and it was a practice called spiritual human yoga. And so I became initiated for that. I had my chakras opened in the parlance of the practice, and it was really powerful, and it was unlike anything I'd done meditation before. I'd done visualizations before, as I said, even from like kind of an early age. But I really felt this like powerful energy moving through me when I was doing this practice, and it was really unusual and kind of eye-opening experience, practicing on myself, practicing on my friends. And so I borrowed money from my parents to go to the big meeting with like the master of the practice in St. Louis, of all places, which I think was taught was one of the chakras of the North American continent in their practice. And when I got there, I became skeptical about the organization. The founder and master of the organization seemed to be kind of like a cult leader, again, in the parlance of our times. That there was, I talk about this in the introduction of the book as well. There was a teaching where he implanted what he called like crystal pyramids in all of our brains, and told us that if we ever had a question about anything, we could psychically communicate with him. And the way that would happen is we could just formulate the question in our mind, and we would hear a still small voice within us. And that was his voice. And so I was just kind of like, okay, this seems manipulative, maybe exploitative. And I started wondering about all the money that was being generated from this. And so again, it was kind of like the pendulum had swung one way, where the practice itself was really, it captured my imagination, my interest. It seemed very powerful, and it opened up maybe something inside me. But on the other hand, it also kind of getting involved with this opened up this new awareness for manipulation, exploitation. And so I think that was the beginning of my interest in it from a more kind of scholarly perspective, right? Where I applied for and received a grant to go around the world learning different forms of energy healing, studying different modalities. And particularly the first research I was doing was with a mind towards the commercial sides of it. And how does money and energy work together? How do those two kinds of things? And so I was looking at more religious forms of healing that used energy, things like Jo-Rei. I don't know if you're familiar with, it's another Japanese energy healing practice in a sense, but it's part of a church. It's part of a religious movement, versus things like Reiki, right? Where there are professional practitioners, people make their living doing Reiki. And so how do those types of practices relate to one another? And one of the things that I found was it seemed that, and this is something that I developed, this is 20 years, more than 20 years before I wrote this book, but actually it was a finding that I end up building upon in the book, was that, the people who do it for money, and people who receive treatments for money, not only is it effective, and I think I even found that it could in some cases be even more effective when it was in this kind of professionalized setting, but that it really gave people an opportunity to devote their life to the practice, right? That there is this capacity for professionalization. Yeah. And although there's a lot of critique of, capitalist spirituality in the field of religious studies where I work, there's also something, I think, about this idea from Buddhism, maybe about right livelihood, about devoting your life. And, everybody has to make money somehow. And so to devoting your life to trying to help people and trying to create a better world in a sense. And there's been other research recently, on spiritual teachers, spiritual practitioners, spiritual healers, that suggests, I think there's a lot of times there's a critique of, it's a money-making thing. It's a, this kind of pyramid scheme kind of thing. And actually, a lot of people are really just scraping by. And I think this comes to no surprise, anyone who actually works in this field, that there is this kind of self-sacrifice that goes hand in hand with going into this kind of work, where most people are not going to make a lot of money as a Reiki practitioner, as a professional practitioner. But they really believe in what they do and they find it rewarding, and that, is its own kind of thing. So anyway, that's kind of going off on a tangent from the original question. But so as part of that research,
an important discussion around it. I like the way you talk about it, because it is a devotion.
Yeah,
it is. And if you can earn an income and be financially supported, it does give you the ability to devote your time and your everything you're doing to the practices.
Yeah. Whereas for a lot of other people, it's more what we think of maybe as like a folk art. I think Phyllis Fromoto used to talk about this kind of folk practice of Reiki, where people who practice on themselves, practice on their friends and family, non-commercially, which seems to be what the ordinary practice was kind of before Hawaii Takata. That one of the things, again, she's maybe criticized sometimes as, she made it too commercial. She made it, right, it's all about, money. But on the other hand, I find that before her, most practitioners were not able to devote their lives to being Reiki practitioners. It's something that people did maybe as part of so-called like folk practice. A lot of the early practitioners were elites, right? People who were financially well off and comfortable, and so could maybe have it as like a hobby that they did, something they do, for people out of the kindness of their hearts, or they were dedicated Buddhists. I find that in Hawaii, the first generation of really dedicated Reiki practitioners in Hawaii were people who were really devout Buddhists, and the Reiki complemented their Buddhism, but it wasn't their primary kind of spiritual practice. Where I find later in Reiki's development, you have people, as I said, who've dedicated their lives to Reiki, who see Reiki as kind of the center of what they do for spiritual development in a way that you don't see in prior generations. So I think that kind of commercialization, professionalization of Reiki is often assumed to be a kind of degradation, right, or a corruption. But I actually see it as having this maybe potential for a devotion, a calling, I call it in the book, right, to Reiki, and so opening up new opportunities for the practice as well.
Yeah, that's interesting because, so, because Sui Sensei opened up a business for it, are you saying that a lot of the people maybe that came from him were more of those folk practitioners? As opposed, other than like maybe a couple, obviously we know the few that, we know about.
And it's funny because a lot of times when you talk about folk in scholarship, a lot of times there's this divide between like the social elites and then the folk. And the folk are like the lower class, uneducated, hoi polloi, and that the elites are the educated, wealthy. But actually the real meaning of folk means just the people, right? It's not just lower class people, but everybody participates in folk culture, right? We all have folk beliefs, regardless of how much money you make or how, what you or your parents did. And so I think that a lot of the early practitioners of Reiki were these folk practitioners, but they were also social elites. It was very expensive to study Reiki under Usui Sensei. The fees for initiation or for becoming a member, it wasn't exactly initiation yet, actually. That's another big thing that changes in the history of Reiki. But the fees for membership, to become a member of Usui Sensei's organization, were very expensive. And so the only people who really could afford to be members were people who were well off. And so at once it's a folk practice and also an elite practice in the early years. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that is I can't wait to hear more. So
keep going.
I know, just keep going.
Yeah, because we could, I have like 10 questions from that, but why don't we keep going on your story and how you got to Reiki? Yeah.
So as part of my postgraduate fellowship, this is in 2001, 2002, where I told you I was being initiated into a number of different types of practices, learning, things from Kundalini yoga to Qigong, but also things like Reiki and Jo-Rei. That was my first Reiki initiations. I did first and second level in India originally, and then also in Japan. And I was practicing Reiki alongside many other things. And then I kind of took a different turn in my life. I became a school teacher in New York City. And at the same time, I kind of had this research in the back of my mind as something that I might like to continue working on at some point, particularly because there was still a lot of unknown. I mean, there's still a lot of unknown stuff today, but at that time, particularly, it felt like Reiki history was just one of these things that there were so many things that people really weren't clear about. There was a lot of misinformation. There still is. But it felt like, okay, this might be something I could keep doing and maybe would become like a profession for me someday, right? Like there's a million Reiki practitioners out there, but how many, Reiki historians, and particularly people trying to do it with integrity and not, just to promote their own practice as I figured out the real, true, authentic Reiki and you can only learn it from me kind of thing. But someone trying to actually figure this out for its own sake, and so that ended up being what happened. I started my master's at the University of Hawaii in 2007. And originally I was again going to do a comparative project between Reiki and Jo-Rei. And my advisors said it's too much for a master's thesis. Just pick one thing. And I was like, well, Reiki, the story really hasn't been told. And so that was my master's thesis, was kind of like, in a sense, like a first draft of this kind of research. And then I went on for my PhD. And so doing my dissertation research, I built on that. And the PhD thesis became, in a sense, a rough draft of what ended up becoming the book. And so, yeah, it's been a long journey. I've over the wet time, learned under different Reiki masters in different styles. I think doing my PhD research, I worked very closely with students of Hawayo Takata from the Usui Shiki Ryoho lineage. And so I think my understanding of that path has deepened through my research. At the same time, I also became a member of the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai in Japan. And so I was able to learn more about what's sometimes called traditional Japanese Reiki, although I also have skepticism about that term, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, so I think getting to know Reiki as practiced in Japan by Japanese lineages, getting to know Reiki as taught by Hawayo Takata in the 1970s. And then, of course, all the other, not all, there's so many, but many other diverse ways that Reiki is practiced around the world today. And seeing all of that diversity, I think, has really given me a lot of perspective, which has been, essential to do this kind of work. Yeah.
So good. Well, I can't wait to hear about how you researched during your master's, your PhD, and then how that also became the book. And then as you're ready, go ahead and tell us about the book and what you learned and what you know. And we're so excited because, like you say, there's just really limited information on the history.
Yeah. And even, there's things that I wrote in the book that it was, I had to finalize the manuscript 6 months ago or something. And there's even things that since then I'm like, if I could, I just realized I said this thing, but it's really a little bit different. It's a moving target in a way, right? As more information comes out, the story is going to get better and better. But I think it's the best available that today. Without being too, with trying to have some humility, I do think I did a pretty good job on it. Yeah. So I think the book offers different things for different audiences, right? And so for the Reiki practitioner, it is a history of Reiki from the perspective of the life and relationships of Hawayo Takata. And so chapter 2 of the book does go back to the early history. It uses sources from Japanese language sources from the 1920s that have never really been talked about in print before. So there is that side of it as well. But the structure of the book, the story of the book, follows the life of Hawayo Takata, and how she came to Reiki and how Reiki changed through her experience with it. And at the same time, it's not just about her. It's not her biography. I really try to stress this network model. And so part of the title, Alternate Currents, is about how the energy, right, the electricity, alternate current, goes back and forth in, I don't know how I'm not an electrical engineer or anything, but I know the basics, I guess, where the transmission of electricity through AC, it primarily moves in one direction, but there are these periodic alternations, they call them, right? So that it goes back and forth. And I think that's also how, in a sense, culture moves. That's how transmission works, is that the teacher is affected by their students, right? That there is this primary direction where, the transmission tends to move in one direction, but it's multi-directional or bi-directional, multi-directional as well. And so that's part of this story, is about how Hawayo Takata's relationships with students, with patients, also impacted the way that she practiced and taught. And that's a part of the meaning of the title, Alternate Currents, as well. At the same time, I think the book also offers something for people who aren't inherently interested in Reiki history, because I try to think about ways where these types of practices, whether it's Reiki, whether it's yoga, whether it's meditation movements, and even, I think to some extent, other types of healing practices from indigenous cultures, from what sometimes called like Black Atlantic religion, like Afro-Caribbean practices, that there are these, what I call transnational spiritual therapies, where they're not quite religion, they're not quite medicine, right? There's something that, a lot of practitioners want to say kind of envelops both of those things. That before there was this differentiation of religion and medicine, right? Before there was this differentiation of the soul and the body, right? There was this kind of spiritual medicine, right? And I think that there's something about that I want to talk about in this book, about these types of practices and how they function in the modern world. And then there's also this aspect, the subtitle talks about the North Pacific, where even in Usui Sensei's time, Japan was not a hermetically sealed bubble, right? That Japan was highly influenced by practices coming from outside of Japan, particularly the so-called West. And part of what I focus on in the book are practices that come from the US to Japan around the turn of the 20th century and helped influence Usui Sensei. And so before Reiki even leaves Japan, it's already what I call like a North Pacific therapy or a transnational therapy, that it's not purely Japanese, because nothing could be at that time, right? That there's always this mixture. And so this idea of circulation, this idea of currents, I think draws on that idea of change, of influence, and this idea that it's always been this kind of North Pacific practice with elements that have a long history in Japan, but also elements that were brought over more recently from North America. And so those are a few different things that I try to do in the book. And so I think that for Reiki practitioners, there's a lot of interest in the history of their own practice, people getting to understand the lineage, people getting to understand why they do certain things, where did that come from? But I think there's also more to offer in the broader perspective about just how cultural practices, and particularly these spiritual therapies, come out of transnational exchanges, and at the same time, how the idea of a homeland for the practice, right? That Reiki is, often called a Japanese healing art, and there is something important there about that. So for yoga as well, right? Seeing India as a homeland, for different types of meditation, seeing Asian homelands, and certainly for indigenous practices, right? Seeing these kind of homelands and these people who have a kind of ownership of the practice, that's an important part as well, right? That these practices do move around the world, and they may take on influences from around the world, but they also kind of have this homeland where they have a special relationship with that place. And if I could say one more thing, that there's something about that place that is seen as restorative, that is seen as having a kind of potency for healing, for spiritual development. And so I think for a lot of people who are in the Reiki world, right? I mean, some people don't even know, Reiki comes from Japan. Like I'm not saying for everybody, but for many people, right, there's an interest in learning more about traditional Japanese arts. There's an interest in doing a pilgrimage to Japan. There's, people watch maybe a Japanese movie, and they say, that really connects with my Reiki practice, right? And so I think there is something about that as well, that Reiki is a global practice. Reiki from its very beginning had global influences, and yet there is something about this nation, right? The land of Japan, the islands of Japan, that feels like an important part of what Reiki is. And I think that that's also true of things like yoga and other, what I call transnational spiritual therapies.
Absolutely. I know that's true with shamanism, which is
certainly
one of my core studies as well. and even Shinto practices in Japan, and shamanic practices from around the world. So yes, I agree with that. Well, I'm so curious about that trans-Pacific part of it. And so I know the book is about Mrs. Takata, and I'd like you to talk about that too. But
Mhm.
can you share some of that early history as well?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we know in the time of Usui Sensei, he had very broad interests. It says this in the memorial stone, that he studied not only things like Japanese magic and Buddhism, but also things like Christianity and psychology. And so I think from the very beginning, the Usui Sensei and his students emphasized that Reiki was this bridging, in a sense, of East and West, of ancient and modern, right? That there is this way that this therapy is a new therapy, right? It says that in all of Usui Sensei's texts, that this therapy has never been taught before, that this is something new. And that part of why it's so popular in modern times is because, first of all, with modernization, people are a bit lost, that things have changed a lot. And so people are like a little adrift, that there's a lot of change in the world. And so people need something to give them a foundation. And at the same time, it's a very simple therapy, right? It's a very simple practice. And so for modern people, right, it's something that anybody can do. It doesn't require going to a monastery. It doesn't require fasting on the mountain, right? Anybody can do this practice. And so I find it interesting, a lot of times people say, oh, well, sure, Dr. Usui or Usui Sensei rediscovered this practice, but it really goes back to ancient Tibet. It really goes back to Atlantis. And that's not what he said. I mean, sure, maybe I'm not going to say, who knows, maybe someone's going to find something else. But he really was clear that I came up with this practice and no one's ever taught it like this before. So that's just one thing off the bat. And then
a quick question about
Yeah,
that.
sure.
Is it the like you kind of said, the blending of these ideas that was what was new?
I
maybe
think exactly right. Exactly right.
Okay.
He said in his text, so there's this one text that he wrote that's called the Kokai Denju Setsume, or the instruction of public the explanation of public instruction. You could read it a couple of different ways, or the public. Yeah. Anyway, the explanation of public instruction, the Kokai Denju Setsume, and in there he said, "I never studied this with anybody." But when you look at the actual practice, there are so many things that other people were teaching around that time and before his time. It seems that he did learn elements from different places, but what was unique was the way he combined them together, right? That the practice, no one had ever taught exactly like this before, even though he had inspiration from these different sources. And like I mentioned, some of those sources are Japanese. This is in chapter 2 of the book. So there are, for example, the initiation practice, or the attunement practice. This seems to come from esoteric Buddhism, that there are very similar practices in Japanese esoteric Buddhism, which go all the way back to ancient India. So in some sense, okay, sure, part of the practice does go back maybe thousands of years before Usui Sensei. Another element are the use of symbols, which also seem to come from esoteric Buddhist practice. And there are some symbols that are very clearly Buddhist, where there's other ones that are maybe Buddhist adjacent, what I might call magic. And so, for example, the distance symbol seems to come from East Asian magic, and particularly for connecting with someone who is far away. On the other hand, there are things that seem very closely influenced by North American practices. And so one of these, But the thing is, the North American practices themselves were sometimes influenced by Asian practices. So, I mean, it's not, it goes around and around.
Alternate currents.
Alternate currents, exactly. But there's this author named William Walker Atkinson, who was a very, very important author in what we might call alternative spirituality around the turn of the 20th century, or sometimes called metaphysical religion around the turn of the 20th century in the US. And he wrote under a number of different pen names, one of which was called Yogi Ramacharaka. And so under the name Yogi Ramacharaka, there were, I think, 13 books that Atkinson wrote. And one of them is called The Science of Psychic Healing. And Usui Reiki Ryoho is so close to what Atkinson wrote about in this book about 20 years before, or maybe 15 years before Usui Sensei started teaching. And the book itself was translated into Japanese in 1916, 6 years before Usui Sensei started teaching. And it's not just Usui Reiki Ryoho, but other therapies around that time in the late 1910s, early 1920s, very, very similar practices. And they all very closely resemble what's in this book, this Japanese translation of Atkinson's book under the name Ramacharaka, that it really seems that Usui Sensei's teaching was part of a kind of movement that my colleague in Japan, Hirano Naoko-san, she talks about the prana healing movement at that time. Ramacharaka, using the Indian term prana, and in his book in Japanese, they use the Japanese version Purana, and there were a number of these different pranic healing therapies. And one of the ways that prana could be translated into Japanese was as Reiki. Or Reiki. So prana healing, also known as Reiki Ryoho, was being taught by a number of different therapists around this time in the early 20th century. And they seem to have been influenced by this American author, who in turn was maybe influenced by things he was learning from yogic pranic healing as well. And I have one more example, if that's okay. Yeah. So the other example is about the power of intention and the power of the divine mind, in a sense, right? And what we call New Thought. New Thought's close cousin, Christian Science. So these were really powerful teachings in late 19th, early 20th century US, that the law of attraction, right, that we, through our mind, through our intention, can manifest health, wealth, success, right? These were big ideas at the time, and they've undergone many revivals since then. The use of the precepts in Reiki, just for today, I will not anger, just for today, I will not worry, seems to come from a Japanese author who had studied Christian Science in the US. And he wrote in his book, his Japanese language book, this little poem that is basically the same as Usui Sensei's precepts about a decade before Usui Sensei started teaching. Oh, maybe 6 years before Usui Sensei started teaching. And, the Kyo dake wa ikaru na. I mean, it's like right in this teaching from this other Japanese author who, again, studied Christian Science in the US and began teaching his students, if you just make these daily affirmations that just for today, you're not going to get angry and you're not going to worry and you're going to be, he didn't use gratitude. He used honesty, but there are little differences, but you're going to, work hard and do your duties well and be kind to people. And if you just say this every day, right, your heart is going to get more pure. In Japanese, heart and mind are the same word, kokoro, but you're going to purify your heart and your mind, and you're going to become a better person. And this is exactly what the early teachings of Usui Sensei say as well. So it seems that Usui Sensei was influenced by a Japanese Christian scientist who learned about this in the US, influenced by the New Thought movement. And then, of course, it comes back to the US through Takada Sensei, and people who are into metaphysical stuff say, oh, this is great. Yeah, it really fits with what I kind of already believed. And it's, again, because of these alternate currents going back and forth in the North Pacific in the 20th century.
So I had always thought that the precepts came from Emperor Meiji.
Right. This is a common misconception. So there are
Yeah,
two.
thank you.
There are, yeah, no, it's actually, I just saw that the other day on August 15th. People celebrate Usui Sensei's birthday, and I saw this article, things you never knew about Usui Sensei, and one of them was about how the precepts came from Emperor Meiji. And so, yeah, this is a common misconception because there was also poetry by Emperor Meiji, which was used by the early Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai in their practices. So they would recite the 5 precepts and they would recite the Emperor Meiji's poetry. And in the memorial stone, it's really unclear, and it's very easy to mistranslate that part to think the 5 precepts come from the Emperor Meiji's poetry. And from what it seems in the records is they recited the Emperor Meiji's poetry, they recited the 5 precepts, but they're actually 2 different like classes of text. And a lot of people have, I think, been a little confused about that for a long time. So I'm actually really glad you brought that up. That the 5 precepts seem to come from a different source. And the Emperor Meiji's poetry is one of the things that got lost in translation, we might say, that particularly during World War II in Hawaii, Japanese Americans were accused of and imprisoned for emperor worship. Right, this was one of the major dangers of being Japanese American in Hawaii during World War II. On the mainland, all Japanese Americans in the Western US and Western Canada were put into camps, were incarcerated. But in Hawaii, only about 1% of Japanese Americans were put into camps. That's because the whole economy would crash if it was about a third of the population was Japanese American. And so they talked about it, but they decided it's just not feasible. And so the people that went into camps a lot of times were religious leaders, were people who taught in Japanese language schools, and people who were associated with the Japanese state in different ways, diplomats and things like that. And emperor worship was one of these things that was seen as real danger at the time. And so I don't know whether Hawayo Takata taught the recitation of the imperial poetry in Hawaii. She started teaching in Hawaii in 1936. It does seem that Hayashi Sensei taught some version of the imperial poetry recitation in Japan in the 1930s. I don't know if it ever made it to Hawaii or not, but certainly by the outbreak of World War II, she was not teaching that anymore. Whether she taught it before or not, I don't know. But so anyway, that's just a whole other can of worms. But there is this idea. Wow. Yeah, there is this idea though that reciting the poetry of the emperor also purified the heart mind. That the emperor was seen as a kind of god, right? Particularly after his death, and so he had this very pure heart mind. And so to recite his poetry in this kind of state would purify the kokoro the same way that reciting the precepts would purify the kokoro. And so they were 2 different types of text, but they were related practices in this type of meditative recitation to purify the kokoro, to purify the heart mind, and to increase one's connection with Reiki with this kind of purity in mind.
So then Usui started his organization, the Gakkai, and can you talk about that part of it and how he developed it to Hayashi, who then, of course, taught Mrs. Takata as well?
So this is still coming out to some extent. There are some very recent sources that have just come out in the last year or so. And I have a colleague, Olaf Bohm, who maybe I could put it in the show notes or something, send you the spelling or something. His book is not finished yet, but it will come out soon. And he has this collection of sources that has really, I don't want to say revolutionized, but has really deepened the understanding of this early history. And some of it is cited and mentioned in this chapter 2 in my book and in the footnotes, but he's going to reproduce and translate all of these early texts, which really will show a lot of that early Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai history, and to an extent that the actual organization in Japan doesn't even know a lot of this stuff. Like that he has a deeper collection of these materials than the actual Gakkai in Japan does, which is like unbelievable. But so I'll just kind of give maybe a bit of an overview so he founded this organization in April 1922. This is all described in the memorial stone. And then the following year, there was this big earthquake in Tokyo. And it seems that during this time, he was practicing so much and attracted, I think, a lot of followers around this time. And it's also suggested in the oral history, I don't have a good source for this, that it was around that time that he began to initiate Shihan, or what we might call Reiki master. So about a year and a half after he founded the Gakkai, there may have been the very first Shihan, or what we might call Reiki masters in Japan, or instructors. And so between 1923 and Usui, like September 1923, and Usui Sensei's transition in March 1926, so again, about like 2.5 years, it seems like that's the time when Usui Sensei trained about 20 Shihan. And also at that time, the organization started to spread through Japan and have different centers. And so at that time, to practice Reiki, you went regularly to a center. You went regularly to a dojo, which they call dojos. And so by regularly attending dojos, you could gradually advance in your practice. And you would get Reiju at meetings. And after a certain number of meetings and a certain number of Reiju, you could then demonstrate your abilities in a kind of practical examination, kind of like martial arts, right? Where you have like a test. And if you are able to demonstrate your abilities, then you could advance to the next level and get the next level of teaching. And so it seems like there was about this 3.5-year period from 1923 to 1926, where under Usui Sensei, a number of centers opened, about 20 Shihan were initiated, and most of them were very high ranked people in society. A lot of military officials, other kind of top people, scientists, business magnates, artists, but these very well-educated, well-established social elite type of people were those initial Shihan. And one of the Shihan, Hayashi Chujiro, a naval captain, became one of these top students of Usui Sensei. And in a source I just found earlier this year, and was one of the very last things to go into the manuscript, I found this kind of who's who description of Hayashi Chujiro Sensei. And it mentions that Hayashi Sensei became the branch manager of the headquarters in Tokyo in 1925. That Usui Sensei was very impressed by his abilities, made him the branch manager. And then Usui Sensei passes away in 26. And then in 27, he started his own organization. So he did not become the second president. This admiral, maybe because of military rank, that Hayashi Sensei was a captain and this admiral became the second president. I don't know, the inside, but that's just a speculation. But yeah, this Admiral Ushida Sensei became the second president of the Gakkai, and Hayashi opened his own organization. And that's where Hawayo Takata did her training, was at the Hayashi clinic and headquarters in Tokyo. So I don't know if that answered all the questions. Yeah, please, Robyn, follow-ups.
Well, I was actually going to say, I don't know if Colleen has a follow-up question about that, but I was going to say, like, I know you said the bulk of your book is kind of, now that we've circled into Takata, I want to hear about some of this early history and missing years.
Yeah, so the first chapter, the introduction, is like an overview of Reiki, and it talks a bit about the contemporary Reiki scene. It talks a bit about the history. It talks a bit about some of the theoretical stuff. But then chapter 1 starts with Takata's story, and with her early years, her childhood in Hawaii, what that was like for her, how it kind of planted seeds for her, how her husband passed away at a very early age, his suffering from illness, and his medical treatment in Japan, and that she would go to Japan with him to receive medical treatment there. And then chapter 2 starts 5 years after his death, when she basically has this breakdown. She has this healing crisis, right? This health crisis, and she goes to Japan for medical treatment and finds Reiki. I think the story is very famous, right? About, she's on the operating table and she hears a voice, right? The operation's not necessary, ask for an alternative. And she ends up going to Hayashi's clinic. And then there's like the flashback, right? Okay, what's Hayashi's clinic? How did this start? And it goes into Usui sensei, it goes into Hayashi sensei. And then, right, it's her training. And this part is really interesting. So this part goes through her own autobiographical recordings, which were made shortly before her death, when Barbara Weber was interviewing her for the autobiography that she meant to write before she died. But then also her class notes, photographs, right? All these different archival materials that had been in these boxes that Phyllis received from her mother, many, many years, and it just sat in storage units. And so some of this diary entries were in the grade book, which were given to Takata and Phyllis's master level students after Takata Sensei's passing. But there were also parts that were not included in that. There were early drafts of her autobiography. And so looking at her training, looking at her certificates that she received from Hayashi Sensei, and learning a bit about how she became really the first non-Japanese, right? She's Japanese American Reiki master, right? That she rapidly advanced in her training, that she, Hayashi Sensei recognized her as an incredibly dedicated and talented practitioner, and chose to make her a Shihan very quickly, that it was less than a year of training. And then she went back to Hawaii, and eventually went back for further training in Japan. And then Hayashi Sensei came back to her in Hawaii, with her to Hawaii. They taught together. She apprenticed with him, and they opened what was the first branch of the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai outside of Japan, in Hawaii. And so it became this kind of overseas branch of the Hayashi organization, and Hawayo Takata was the president of that branch, right? And so that goes into chapter 3, which is the practice in Hawaii in what I call like the trans-war period, right? So late 1930s into World War II, and then into the immediate post-war period, where the vast majority of practitioners were Japanese Americans, people who were immigrated to Hawaii from Japan, and their children learning from Hawayo Takata in those trans-war years. And I mentioned a little bit before how that was informed by their Buddhist practice. There's interesting kind of period in that there is the beginning. We often see Reiki practiced disproportionately by women, and you see this in the Japanese American community in Hawaii. Reiki was practiced in beauty salons in Honolulu before World War II. There was also this kind of Japanese nationalist who was the treatment manager in Honolulu right before World War II, who was Takata and Hayashi's landlord. And he was this kind of like ultra nationalist, like pro-military, very masculine kind of guy. And he was also a top Reiki person in the Japanese American community at that time. So there's real like diverse types of practitioners. But what we really do see, though, are these very dedicated folk practitioners who do treatments a lot like what was looking in Japan at that time. People were practicing with one hand. This is a thing that you see in some of my work about early Reiki. A lot of times it was a single hand for treatment, and people would treat for hours on end. That it was not going through the foundation treatment. It was using your hand to find vibrations in the body, places that they call like the source of disease. So using the sensitivity in your hand to find those places. And sometimes, especially for someone who has a severe chronic issue, people would treat with their hand on that spot for hours on end, sweating, sometimes painful feelings, both for the practitioner and the recipient. One person who I interviewed in Hawaii who had back pain, she said it was so painful, she was crying and saying to the practitioner, please, like, I think it's enough. And she said, basically, do you want to get better or not? Like, and I mean, there's a lot of that type of intense treatments in that time. And we often think of Reiki now as a very gentle treatment, as people often fall asleep during treatments. But it seems that a lot of this practice in early Japan and also in early period in Hawaii, particularly for chronic and difficult treatments, were marathon sessions with often with multiple practitioners. That there was one family that I interviewed where the father initiated other members of his family in order to have people help him out. He had gone back to Japan and received further training from Hayashi's widow, Hayashi Chie. This is all in chapter 3. And then a lot of these practitioners were very critical of Hawayo Takata for starting this clinic where she did 1 hour treatments for money. And they said for 1 hour, and that's it. Like, my father would treat for many hours and, for free. And that was another thing, was that at that time, a lot of the folk practitioners didn't have set treatment fees that they Japanese culture, if you receive something, someone does a favor for them, of course you reciprocate, right? And so people would come with donations, whether it was money, whether it was food, whether it was beer. So we talked to people bringing 6-packs to the house to say thank you for the treatment. And that same family, one of his daughter who I interviewed said, sometimes patients would come for years with presents for her father, and he said, "Okay, enough already. This is it's too much." But yeah, that was kind of the folk kind of practice in Hawaii in those years, and so that was part of my research. And then the fourth chapter looks at Takata's early teaching on the mainland, where most of her students were white, where most of them were Christian, and how how her students really saw her as like a messenger from God. I mean, you see this in the letters, that she's a gift to humanity, that her practice, her teaching was just transformational for people's families, for people's lives. But she didn't keep practicing. It's like this really interesting period where she taught in this big teaching tour in 1951. She had some people that she taught even before World War II. So Doris Duke is a very famous example. She was like the richest woman in the world, I think second to Queen Elizabeth at the time. She was the sole heir to like the tobacco monopoly in the US. Duke University is, part of her legacy. And so she was a student of Hawaii Takata, but she also had a lot of middle class students. She had students who were immigrants from Europe who worked as was one woman in particular, and I spoke to her daughter, who worked as a seamstress in New York City in 1951, and was a lot of her students at that time were into alternative health, alternative spirituality, in this like early 1950s period. And she taught all over the US in this one teaching tour that I talk about in chapter 4. But she also seemed to, after that, kind of take it easy. She had some high profile students and patients in Beverly Hills, in Hollywood. I think really, and again, this is a question I have in my research, but she became a landlady. She invested in real estate. She seemed to have other streams of income coming in. She seemed to practice massage and maybe practice Reiki to some extent, but that she kind of became, in her like 50s and 60s, this kind of comfortable, somewhat, I want to say maybe upper middle class. I don't know exactly, how you characterize her socioeconomic level at that time, but she was pretty comfortable, it seems. And then I think in the 1970s, she really started to feel like, okay, I have this responsibility where I need to find a successor. I need to find people who are going to practice and pass on this practice. That if I don't teach another generation of teachers, another generation of Reiki masters, the practice is going to die out. And so that's what that last chapter is really about, is her practice and teaching in the 1970s. And a lot of what I emphasize there is about the ways that Reiki changed in the 1970s. A lot of the new things that she introduced to the practice have to do with trying to make her white Christian students more like Japanese in some ways. That she feels like, okay, they don't respect hierarchy. They don't respect their teachers. They don't respect their elders. So I'm going to make this new Reiki ideal, respect or honor your parents, teachers, and elders, right? She added this new precept, and that did not exist before Hawaii Takata. But I think she felt these hippies who I'm teaching, or these these students who keep asking me all these questions, is too many questions. Just practice, right? And so she changed the practice to try to make her students, her white Christian students in the US, more like Japanese people, right? You give something, you have to, or you receive something, you have to give something, right? The exchange of energies, this idea of reciprocity, the idea of the oral tradition. And you don't take notes in class, you just watch. You watch what I do and do it the way I do, and everything else Reiki will teach you, right? There's no notes, there's no manual, right? That's different from actually how she learned. She received a manual, she took notes in class, but she, I think, was trying to make her students just more like Japanese students. And so that's part of my argument is that part of her transformation of Reiki in the 1970s is actually about what I call like the Japanization of Reiki, which is like a little ironic, right? That like it's often talked about like the westernization of Reiki, maybe like the corruption of Reiki. But I think she was really trying to make her students more like Japanese students. So anyway, that's kind of the last chapter looks at that, looks at the influence. Oh, I should have the book here, but I think it's in the other room. But there was this book where she appeared in this book called We Are All Healers. It came out in 1973. And that book was part of the explosion of interest in her teaching. I talk about that in the book as well. She started getting mail from all over the world sent to her with no address, because her address wasn't in the book. And so the mail was sent to Honolulu just saying Hawaii Takata, spiritual healer, Waikiki. And the post office in Honolulu just knew, okay, it's another letter for this Takata woman. And they just started delivering it to her house and, putting the address on it. And so she was getting dozens of letters from all over the world, inviting her to come teach, inviting her to, do treatments. And so there was this kind of print stuff. Yeah. And also her involvement with different metaphysical Christian movements. I think it's well known, she, as like Reverend Takata in her final years, she became ordained as this church called the Universal Church of the Master that was in the suburbs of San Francisco. And so, there's like these ways where kind of metaphysical Christian teachings, her autobiography was going to be called Reiki is God Power. And so there's ways where, she really wants to make it accessible for white Americans, right? Because that's, who she was teaching at the time. There were still Japanese American students, but the majority of her students were white Americans, white Christians. And so she wanted to make it accessible. And at the same time, she put in these things to try to make it her students like more like Japanese students is what I think about.
Do you think that it was more acceptable in that time frame because we were further away from World War II to be able to introduce, more Japanese styles of learning? And
definitely, and to call it like a Japanese art and things like that. That there's some stuff in chapter 4 about how during World War II there was so much racism and so much anti-Japanese sentiment, and within 5-10 years after the end of the war, there was this complete reversal as Japan became this close ally of the U.S., the U.S. occupation of Japan. And Japan becomes this ally in the Cold War, right? Where the Soviet Union and communism are this kind of threat to the US. And Japan is like our closest ally in Asia all of a sudden. So there is this huge reversal of what I call like the meaning of Japanese-ness in the immediate post-war period. Yeah.
So did you say she was teaching or practicing, for lack of better words, in that 1951 time period where she was touring?
Both. She was,
Where are this? I'm curious as to, it sounds like you've interviewed some of them, the students of that time frame.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So she started teaching white students in Hawaii, like just before World War II, right around the beginning of World War II. So 1941, right before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, she started having white students in Hawaii. And some of them moved to the mainland during the war. And she was getting letters from people saying, we can't wait for you to come teach. When the war is over, you got to come here. We got all these people who want to learn from you. And the big teaching tour was in 1951. She started in the Seattle area. She had a family that was kind of her sponsor there. She went down to the LA area where she had a bunch of people interested. She went out to Texas. She went up to New York City. She seemed to have spent some time in New York City. She taught a bit in Ohio, it seems. She went to this health retreat in Pennsylvania, I think. So really pretty widespreading teaching tour. Later in life, she really focused her teaching basically from Chicago west. So she taught a lot around the Bay Area. She taught around Chicago in the suburbs, and then she taught in BC, where I live now. That out of her 22 well-recognized master level students, 20 out of 22 were either in the Bay Area, Chicago, or BC. The two exceptions, interestingly, were Phyllis Furumoto and Barbara Weber. And that they were the only two outside of those three major centers. And I think, as is well known, they, in the 1980s, both claimed to be the successors of Hawayo Takata. So it's kind of interesting that they're like the outliers of the masters, But in my research, I did find that Takata asked a number of people if they wanted to be her successor. And I think, unfortunately, it turned into a major misunderstanding. I think my theory, again, this is my interpretation of the data, but that Hawayo Takata did not expect to pass away the day that she passed away. That she thought she was going to see Phyllis again. Phyllis had asked her to help finish her training, in a sense. And we're actually speaking right after Phyllis's birthday. She would have been 75 yesterday, the day before we were recording this. and I hope she's okay with me saying this, but I think that Phyllis really wanted to finish her training with her grandmother, with her Reiki master, and her grandmother told her, Reiki comes first, go teach, and I'll see you back in Iowa. And in a sense, like, we're going to finish your training then. And then she passed away before they were able to see each other again. I think that the history could have been quite different if she hadn't passed away exactly. It would have been 2 weeks before her 80th birthday that Hayao Takada passed away. And so I think there was a lot of confusion in the 1980s around this kind of succession stuff. And I think there's still some people who have bad blood about it, over 40 years later, which is really unfortunate. And it's something that seems to happen periodically in Reiki history, where there are these conflicts between different lineages. And it's really one of the unfortunate things, I think, about the politics of the practice, is that it's about healing. It's about, trying to help people make a better world and things like that. And so, it's a real shame. But I definitely, in my research, I found a number of people who Takada was kind of, I think, testing out to see if they were interested in becoming her successor before Phyllis agreed to become it. And there were some letters that she wrote to Phyllis that some of them are quoted in my book and some of them are quoted in some other books as well, where she mentions, to Phyllis, like, you're going to be the number one Reiki practitioner. I want to leave the whole thing to you on a silver platter. But she never publicized those letters. She kept them very private. Her mother was a very private person. And I think that there was something where she felt like, this is not something I should need to publicize. People should recognize me as a successor. I shouldn't need to, photocopy this letter and put it on the internet. That it really should be this kind of energetic recognition. And it's kind of unfortunate that that I think that part of the history was kind of kept secretive for so many years. Yeah.
Well, I love this this line in your description about the book, that Alternate Currents explores Reiki as an exemplary transnational spiritual therapy, demonstrating how lived practices transcend artificial distinctions between religion and medicine. And, I think that piece of it is so true with Reiki and so much of where we are today, trying to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, there's this kind of work to, how do you negotiate? I actually wrote another piece about this that will come out at some point, but about people doing Reiki in hospitals, right? People doing Reiki, whether it's trying to get reimbursed from medical insurance or, and then also on the other side, there's like efforts to regulate Reiki. And, it's kind of exists in this in-between space, right? It is spiritual, right? It's something more than just a massage, right? There is like something metaphysical, if you want to call it that. And at the same time, right, people are very clear, this is not a religion, right? And so there is this kind of, it occupies this kind of weird between space in that we don't really know, or that the establishment doesn't really know how to navigate, right? That people want treatments in hospitals, that people are requesting it, and some people might say, oh, this is not appropriate because of my religious beliefs, like the Catholic Church guidelines and things like that. And then on the other hand, I think there are some practitioners also that just see religion as kind of like a dirty word and don't want anything to do with religion. And so there's so many types of practitioners out there. It's a very complex landscape to navigate.
It is, and it's trying to teach us that, again, to transcend those differences. So I'm curious about a lot of, I guess, what I've heard about Mrs. Takada's version of the history of Reiki, and Later, what we learned were there were differences in her history, what was written in the memorial stone, what the research has shown. And so things such as the charging money, the $10,000 fee, the oral tradition, even the foundation hand placements. So, and that Usui was Christian. So it sounds like you were talking about that to bring it more back into some Japanese roots. So can you share about that part of it?
Sure.
Because I've always seen her as just this tremendous innovator.
Yes.
Like she just brought these practices together as a way that without the way she was guided to do it, it might not have made it in the West to the degree that it did.
No, for sure. For sure. So yeah, it's a loaded subject. And I do get into it a bit in the book. I think when this stuff started coming out in the late 1990s, where people started saying, wait a minute, the things that she said weren't literally true. There were some people who had very strong reactions, she's a liar. You can't believe it. And I think that, again, the pendulum, I think, swung very far in one direction. And I think it's swinging back where people can recognize, okay, some of the things in the Reiki story may not be literally true and may not be what I like to distinguish between story and history, right? That I think a lot of what she teaches or what she taught had a lot of meaning, had a lot of purpose as parables, as teaching stories. And there's a lot of truth in her Reiki story that may not be literally exactly what happened in Usui Sensei's path, in his life story, but at the same time captures important teachings in a way that made them legible, made them understandable to her students. And so, for example, the story about the beggar's camp, right, is a very famous Reiki story that when Usui Sensei came down from the mountain and knew that Reiki healed, he dedicated his life to doing free treatments of people who were very poor, right, living in this beggar's camp. And as she often told the story, he spent 7 years treating all of these different beggars in the camp. And after 7 years of treating them, he realized people were returning. He had healed their infirmities, their disabilities, and people went off to go find honest living. And then what happened? They found the life was too difficult to work, and they preferred to beg. And they came back to the camp. And Usui Sensei, as she said, threw himself into the mud and gnashed his teeth and pounded his fists into the mud and said, I was wrong. I shouldn't have taught for free. They didn't have the gratitude that they need, that they didn't ask for this healing, that I was giving it away for nothing. And then she told a story about herself and how she trained her sister and her neighbors who had helped take care of her children when she was in Japan. And again, they didn't value the teaching because she gave it away for nothing. And she said, and not one of them went on to be successful. She had all this stuff, right? That like, you have to have this reciprocity, right? This exchange of energies. And she said, that's why Usui Sensei developed the precepts, right? Was to teach people about gratitude, and that gratitude is the foundation of healing. Okay. Again, I don't think the story is literally true. At the same time, it seems like a really important parable about the healing power of gratitude, right? About reciprocity, about honoring oneself and one's practice, and how to do that in a society where, we live in this capitalist society, right? That like charging for your time, charging for your treatments, charging for your teachings is a way to support yourself and help spread the practice and help make a living doing that. And so I think that part of the teaching, part of that story is based on true story. Like I mentioned about his work in the aftermath of the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. I think that he did devote his life to practicing. I think that he did give free treatments to very poor people. And he also did charge a lot of money in his organization for initiation. And at the same time, Usui Sensei and Takata Sensei did give free trainings and did give free treatments for certain people who were really in need. Takata Sensei often would like train members of a family. She often liked to train husband and wife so they could treat each other. And then elderly people in the family, the grandparents, she would train for free, or children, she would train for half price or something like that. And so I think a lot of the stories she told and a lot of the teachings people received turned into these kind of like orthodoxy, you have to do it just like this. This is how Takata did it. And when you actually look into the details, she had exceptions. She had flexibility. Rick Bachner, his training $10,000 fee, he ended up paying her half of that. And the other half was the students who took classes with her that he organized the classes, and she applied that $5,000 towards the $10,000. Right? She had a number of arrangements with students who really couldn't pay, right? And there were other students for whom $10,000, even though it's a significant investment, they had the money. And so she had flexibility. And again, I think the idea about the 10,000 in East Asian culture, 10,000 is a symbolic number. It means like a lot. In the Tao Te Ching, they talk about like creation as like the 10,000 things. It means just like the whole world in a sense. And she told a story about having to mortgage her house in order to pay for her training. And I think that might have been true. I think the records from her inheritance from her husband's passing, and then that she moved to Honolulu, I think she might have sold her house to pay Hayashi Sensei for her training. I don't have hard, fast evidence for that, but it fits with the evidence that we do have. And so I think the idea of the $10,000 training, on the one hand, to become a Reiki master is maybe the most significant, commitment that someone can make. And so it's a symbolic number to say you have to give up something huge in order to receive this powerful, transformative, training. And on the other hand, does it have to be exactly $10,000 every time? I mean, people are still charging $10,000 where she was charging $10,000. I'm trying to do the math in my head right now. I'm having a moment, but like almost 50 years ago, obviously with inflation, $10,000 today is a fraction of what it was back then. I think I have the number in my book. I think it's about the equivalent of about $40,000 in 2023 dollars. And so, there I think is this symbolic truth in a lot of her teachings, even when the stories, the numbers, she adapted for different audiences. Oh, one last thing about the Usui story. A recent book just came out. I actually don't even have the hard copy of it, but I've read part of it online. This Australian researcher named Elizabeth Latham. And I should mention, she has this new book that from what I understand about the book, I don't necessarily agree with all of her findings. I think she has some provocative hypotheses that Reiki was actually not developed by Usui, but by his cousin, who was this Japanese Christian. And again, I don't know. I have to read the book. It's very long, and I don't know that I agree with all of her findings, but it does seem that she found, which I think is a very major, for people who are like Reiki nerds about Reiki history, a major finding is that a lot of the Takata story about Usui seems to be based on this other figure from that time, who is a Japanese Christian, who was a teacher at Doshisha University, who was interested in the secret of how Jesus was able to heal people. Like that part of the story seems to be based on an actual person. And I had been interested in that for a long time and was never able to find it. So kudos to Elizabeth Latham, who seems to have uncovered maybe that part of the puzzle. Yeah.
Really interesting. Who is the other person that you had said that is going to be having a book?
Olaf Bohm, which is a B-O with an umlaut, like the two dots over it, and then HM. And yeah, he keeps like saying, "Oh yeah, the book is almost done," and then he's like, "Oh no, I need to add one more chapter about this other text," and I'm like, "Okay, I know, but like at some point you have to put the book out." So he's planning to have it out before the end of this year. We'll see, but it should be out soon.
Yeah.
Olaf Bum's book. I cite it, even though it's not published yet. I cite it in my book, so I can tell you the title of that one is "A Journey to Oneness with the Universe: Early Documents and Practices of Usui Mikao Sensei's Reiki Therapy."
Oh, great name.
I know.
Yeah,
Good title.
Well, I met both of you at the Japanese conference
Oh, okay.
That's right.
with Doi Sensei in April.
Yeah.
And so, and he had said that he was doing the continuing research. And then didn't both of you spend time in Japan over the summer doing more research?
Yeah. Right after the conference, I was there for about another month. I think he was there for about another 2 months. And yeah, the research never sleeps. Yeah.
I know. And it's so fascinating. I love the story too about the information with an additional person that perhaps some of the history is also referring to as Usui Sensei, because there's been a part, of course, when I first received Reiki, it was with the history of Mrs. Takata and the story about Usui receiving Reiki to experience how Jesus healed.
Yeah.
And I just found the evolution of it so interesting, because I also learned it during a time of some very strict rules around how to practice it and the incorrect ways to practice it. So the history for me has always been fascinating, with the development of that kind of evolution of understanding different time frames in how we practiced Reiki, our beliefs around how to practice Reiki. And for me, realizing that Usui Sensei practiced a spiritual, intuitive style of Reiki, for me, that was very, very provided a lot of freedom for me, because I naturally was guided. I naturally was intuitive with it, but I had learned very strict rules, like the 3-minute hand positions, and have the music that that chimes every 3 minutes to let you know when you can move. And
right, and it's interesting. I mean, it's called a foundation treatment. Like the foundation implies that's not all there is, right? That's the basic level. And Takata. You look at Takata's teachings. Remove the cause, you remove the effect, right? That she was very much, I mean, that's a Japanese Reiki teaching right there, right? That there are certain parts of the body where are the cause of disease. You need to treat the cause. That it has to be, your hand has to go to that spot, because that's where the cause of disease is coming from. And you might not be able to do it all in one day. You do multiple treatments, right? That you're seeing the patient over and over again, working on that cause. And over time, it's going to change, right? And they're going to change their whole thing. And then there might be another spot that needs attention in the future. And so that's one thing that's really in her teachings. Reiki will guide you, right? Listen to your hands. Someone, she said over and over again, listen to your hands. How could that possibly mean you have to only have your hands in these spots for this long? Like, listen to your hands. It seems like a pretty clear thing. Like, use your intuition, right? Like, listen to your hands will guide you. Reiki will guide you. And yeah, so there's a important practice in Japanese lineages called Reiji Ho, which maybe you've heard of, but it's basically about, your hands will go where they need to go. Yeah. And
I think that a lot of the rules that I learned were really even after Mrs. Takata, that developed from that period of 1980 to 2000. And then that, discovery of the memorial stone opening the doors to research and understanding of that. So was Mrs. Takata then, part of the story I've learned is that she was pretty disconnected from Reiki in Japan after World War II, that she was pretty well in the West.
It's a complicated question. It's certainly she, I think, saw the future of Reiki being outside of Japan. She was asked. I mean, some of this stuff is a little bit hard to know the exact details, but evidence supports her story that she was asked to take over Hayashi's clinic in Japan by Hayashi's widow, Hayashi Chie, and that she declined. That she did not want to move to Japan. She did not want to be in charge of Japanese students. I think she probably felt like she might not be respected by Japanese students, that she was a woman, that she was a Japanese American, that a lot of the students in Japan were high class people, and she was from a plantation. I mean, she's a real rags to riches story. I mean, she grew up to migrant laborers. And so I see all of that as tied up with her saying, I don't want to become the second president of the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai. And she deferred to allow Hayashi's widow to take over. And then she didn't end up, she ended up basically closing shop, I think by the early 50s. And that was kind of the end of the Hayashi Reiki Kenkyukai. I think she did have some classes in Japan in the 1970s. She definitely went over to Japan a number of times in the post-war decades, and there is some record of her teaching over there. And there's even the possibility that she went to the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai. I know two of her master students, Fran Brown and Shinobu Saito, both went to the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gakkai. And so there were some connections in the post-war period and in the post-Takata period, but it wasn't something that was widely pursued. I know, for example, the work of Frank Arjava Petter and others, where they were kind of turned away from the Gakkai. And so the word kind of became, oh, the Gakkai is not interested in any foreigners, or not interested in any, that it's a secret society, all this kind of stuff circulated as well, which again, I think is a little bit overstating the case. They do have some foreign language, or rather some foreign members, but because the whole Gakkai meetings are all conducted in Japanese, it's very hard to participate if you don't speak Japanese. Even my Japanese is like pretty good, and there's so much that goes on at the meetings where I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about. But what makes me feel a little bit better is some of the people who run the meetings are very very like intellectual type. One of the former president, Kondo Sensei, he was like a university president. And sometimes I ask some of the other people, I'm like, so what was Kondo Sensei talking about there? They're like, oh, I don't understand either. Like Japanese people are like, oh, I don't know what he's talking about either. So, okay, I feel a little bit better. But yeah, so there is definitely a bit of a disconnect. I know I've gone a little bit past your question, but I hope that maybe in the future with a generational shift in that organization, that it's possible that maybe in the future there can be some communication, reconciliation between the Gakkai and Reiki practitioners from outside of Japan, but we're not quite there yet. So watch the space, as I say. And but yeah, no, the question about Hawao Takata, I think that she taught her students. It basically died out in Japan. And I think as far as she knew, that was basically true. I think it was really after her death that Shinobu Saito was able to make a connection with the Gakkai. And then in the 80s, there was also a student of Barbara Weber, Mitsui Mieko, and she also found the Gakkai and found that they weren't really interested in dealing with Western practitioners. So when Mitsui and Frank Petter and others started teaching in Japan, there was kind of like, yeah, the Gakkai exists, but they're not really interested in having anything to do with. And then, of course, around 1999, Doi Sensei, and then Yamaguchi Chiyoko Sensei, and then her students, started teaching Jikiden and Komyo, and so there's all this, kind of development of new, old Japanese Reiki lineages as well. Yeah.
Right. And you said you're a member of the Gakkai.
Yep.
Yes. How did that come about?
So you need an invitation from a current member, And so I got my invitation from my colleague who I mentioned before, whose name is Hirano Naoko-san, or sensei. She has a PhD too. She teaches in Japan, and she was doing research on Reiki history, and she met a member, and that member invited her. So it was through that kind of invitation system. And yeah, I had to sign when I joined. I had to sign something that said I wasn't going to like share with the outside world what exactly goes on at meetings and stuff. So there is, I guess, a bit of a secret society vibe a little bit. And those types of pledges, they actually had that in back in the day as well. In Olaf's book, when you see those translations, they have this kind of like oath that you would sign not to discuss the goings on at the meetings with non-members. So that's an older Japanese custom as well. But they know that I wrote this book. I sent them the manuscript. The current president and the previous president both speak English, actually. So I asked them specifically, like, oh, could you please review these pages of the manuscript where I mention your name, I mention a story that you told me, and they okayed all that stuff. So that's okay. And I gotta say, like, obviously, like, people in the Gakkai have dedicated their life to these practices and have, but like, I think there's often this like conflation of like, the more traditional, like the older the practice is, the better it is, right? That people want to do it like the old way equals the real way. And I've gotten all kinds of Reiki treatments from all kinds of practitioners. And like, it doesn't necessarily mean that like the most traditional Reiki society is doing the best Reiki out there in the world. I mean, there's a lot of wonderful types of Reiki out there. And so I think there is like a lot of like desire to find out, the true original practice, and to, all that newer stuff isn't good. But like, part of the reason Hayao Takata made these changes, treating with two hands, for example, she practiced for 45 years. Like, I think she found out, oh, actually treating with two hands can be effective in certain, cases, or like in many cases. So yeah, well, use two hands.
And technique is technique, and the energy is the energy.
That too. That too. So I think a lot of it, is about that sincerity of heart, that there's this idea that goes all the way back to Usui, but I think you still see it, with practitioners today, that if you are really, setting right intentions and, trying to be the best person you could be and have that pure heart, pure mind, don't let ego get too in the way. It's not about you. It's about the source of Reiki, and just being open to that. I think, it's hard to go wrong in some ways.
Yeah.
Well, and I know for myself, there are so many different ways that I've personally had to practice Reiki because of my life circumstances, that I know Reiki responds to us through our need. And so the practices are personally rich and rewarding, and they work. At the same time, Reiki is such an universal, all-encompass energy that, in my experience, it responds to us based on saying yes to it, inviting it, letting it come in and do the work however we need it in the moment we need it. And I think the evolution of Reiki, even watching Mrs. Takata and the innovations that she brought into the practice. And, I guess I knew that she had practiced for the length of time she did. I just kind of never put it together that was for 45 years. And of course, wow, that's of course what you learn from it, and teach it and share it and innovate with it.
Yeah.
And speaking of life circumstances, having to let it show you how to, it can adapt with you and your life circumstances, because she had some pretty major ones.
Oh yeah.
During that time. Yeah.
And also, I mean, the 45 years, obviously, like that, the deepening of your practice, but she also had, remarkable effects as a young woman too, as a young practitioner. And so, there's definitely this, on the one hand, you deepen your practice, you deepen your connection, your techniques, your what have you. But at the same time, if you're, I think, dedicated from the beginning, you can have really remarkable experiences and outcomes just as a new practitioner as well. So, a big beginner mind.
Yes.
I love that. As you said, she said, God power. With humility, we say that, of course. Well, this has just been so fascinating, Justin. Thank you so much for being on with us and sharing and your book and research and just wow. So
can't wait to read it.
Yeah, really excited.
Thanks so much.
To get that. So let's just go over again how to find you. We can find you at Justin Stein, which is stein.academia.edu. You're on Facebook as JBS Reiki Research. And then you can pre-order the book now. It will be out on September 30th. If you can find it at a local bookshop, do that first. But it is also everywhere that you can order books if you need to do that too. So is there any other information on how people can find you or anything else that you'd like to share, Justin?
Justin Stein Reiki Research on Facebook is definitely like the most up-to-date stuff. And then the title of the book again, Alternate Currents. I hope people like it. I hope maybe it spurs more questions, and you can hit me up via Facebook, as a lot of people reach out there, comment, whatever. I don't know. I don't love Facebook either, but it just seemed to be a real convenient way of being in touch with people. And I've got other Reiki stuff in the works. I've got a book of translations that I'm trying to get out. My own translations of the Memorial Stone and the Kokai Denju Setsume that I mentioned before, but also all these Japanese language articles about Reiki from the 1930s, 1940s. I've done so much of this work, and it's like, oh yeah, I should make this available. So I don't know, maybe next year. I also teach a lot. I'm about to start the new semester, so it was one of these things. Is like, oh, if I can get that done this summer, that would be great. But it didn't get done. But maybe next year, a new book of translations coming out. But yeah, no, I'm real happy. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to get to know both of you a little bit better, and and I think that's about it.
Well, we'll have to have you back on when you get those done too, or even before
if you read the book, you got any questions, hit me up.
You said too there was some another place that we could find. Was it some of your work too? Some of your papers that have been published?
That was the academia.edu.
Okay.
And I think so for the actual academia site, you need to make a profile, but I think the justinstein.academia.edu, I think you can just download stuff for free from there.
Okay. Awesome.
With no profile. Yeah.
And so when you say that you're teaching in the university, are you teaching Reiki classes at all?
No. I teach just basically courses on East Asia, history, culture, and particularly about Japan. And I do have some classes about religion in East Asia. I do have some classes about I supposed to teach it in the spring about health and healing in East Asia. But no, I'm not a Reiki master. I'm a second degree practitioner. And I think I kind of like being in that spot because first of all, there's a lot of issues around attunement, initiation that like I just don't have to deal with because I'm like, yep, I don't know. I'm not a master. I never learned how to initiate people, so I don't know how to do Reiju. People are always asking me, is Reiju the same as initiation? I'm like, you know what? I just don't have to answer that question because I don't know. So that's nice. And yeah, I like practicing Reiki. When people who are practitioners, we hang out. I like to exchange treatments, but I'm not a professional practitioner myself or a teacher. So that's
You're a researcher and author
Keeps you, it's more
and
objective
historian.
perspective.
Try
Yeah.
to stay in my lane. Try to stay in my lane. Yeah. And there's plenty of other people. You want to learn Reiki? There's plenty of other people out there to learn from, and some great teachers out there. So I'll let them do that work.
And we're just spreading it in the world.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Justin. Again, what a great conversation and the depth of information. I'm really excited to read your book. And that again is Alternate Currents, Reiki's Circulation in the 20th Century North Pacific. So just September 30th. All right.
All right. Thank you.
And of course, Robyn and I are Reiki Lifestyle. And so you can find anything about our information on our website, ReikiLifestyle.com, and the podcast, etc. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.